Recently, I purchased Ubiquiti's newly released UXG-Pro, so I have 3 different UniFi routers. This video is for comparison among the 3 routers on the remote user VPN performance. Unfortunately, Ubiquiti still doesn't support OpenVPN in the remote user VPN scenario. In this video, I'm going to use the built-in L2TP for testing. On the screen, I'm showing 2 pages from Wikipedia explaining L2TP. Layer 2 tunneling protocol, or L2TP, is a widely used VPN protocol. It's supported by many common operating systems, but the L2TP itself is missing some major features. Normally, it's used together with IPsec. When you set up the VPN in your operating system, you will see L2TP over IPsec. In this video, I won't explain the details about the different protocols and different settings. I will keep the default UniFi setting and focus on the network speed testing. Let's talk about the testing environment. First, about USG-Pro. In my home network, I use PFSense as the main router to connect to internet, and I use UniFi switches. To test the 3 UniFi routers, I connect them in the lab environment. For the USG-Pro, it's connected with my home network using a 1 gigabit connection, and internally it's using a small UniFi switch connected to 2 different Linux virtual machines, one running the UniFi controller, the other one running a test Linux server. I can use it to test the VPN network speed. And in the home network side, I have a Mac machine here. In the testing, I'm going to use the Mac machine to connect to the router using VPN. From the Mac machine, I'm going to run the IPsec testing against this Linux machine. As you may notice, I make sure I set the Mac machine in the same subnet as the WAN interface of the router so that it can directly connect to the router instead of go through the PFSense for inter-VLAN routing. And another thing, as you can see, all the connections are in green color here because we are talking about the USG-Pro. It only supports maximally 1 gigabit connection. Okay, so this is USG-Pro. Move on to UDM-Pro. It's very similar. Some differences are here in the lab environment. I use a 10 gigabit aggregation switch. All the connections are blue color, which is 10 gigabit. This is UDM-Pro, so I don't need a separate machine to run the controller. It's built in. And everything else is the same as USG-Pro. Move on to UXG-Pro. It's almost identical to the UDM-Pro. The only difference is here. I need a separate Linux virtual machine to run the network controller. The testing environment is very simple. Let's get started. Let's start with USG-Pro. Here you see the network diagram. In this corner, I show the UniFi network controller. Here in the left lower corner, I show the Mac machine, and in the middle, a terminal, which I'm going to use SSH, log on to the router. In this corner, I show the Linux home machine. First, let's check the VPN setting. In this video, we are focusing on the remote user access VPN. L2TP is the only supported and recommended protocol. The setting itself is super easy. Ubiquiti hides all the details about L2TP, IPsec, and the radius. For the testing purpose of this video, it's very straightforward. Of course, protocol L2TP, you need to give it a pre-shared key. The server address is this one port's IP address, and here I create a user. In the menu setting part, set the special subnet for the VPN network. Of course, this video is not about site-to-site VPN. Yeah, that's the easiest setting in the UniFi controller side, but you may expect to see some settings for, let's say, IPsec. In the backend for USG-Pro, you have the advantage to use the command line tool to show something more, which is default or hidden setting within the router. Let me show you. I'm going to use this terminal configure command. to enter the config mode, then run show VPN L2TP remote access IPsec settings. As you can see here, it's showing the pre-shared secret and it has the IKE lifetime setting. IKE is for Internet Key Exchange Protocol. So this setting, you don't see it in the front end, but in back end, you do see this setting. I won't spend time on this back end setting. Basically, I just want to show Ubiquiti does have some additional settings, but it's hidden. We are already in the SSH. Let me run top command, because we are going to need it anyway. Now let's move on to the Mac machine part. In the Mac machine, go to the network setting. I already configured VPN connection here, server address from the network controller. It lists the WAN port IP address. Account name is the one we set here in the user authentication part. And if you go to the authentication setting, this part is the pre-shared key we configured in the UniFi controller. And this part is the user's password we configured here. In the advanced part, by default, it's not selecting this setting. Send all traffic over VPN connection, just to make sure for all the network traffic I want to be routed to the UniFi router. Okay, connect it. It's super easy to set up in both server and in client. And this L2TP connection VPN setting is built in macOS, and in Windows it should be the same case. So that's why L2TP over IPsec is so popular, because it's widely supported. But it has an apparent disadvantage, which is the speed. You will see that very soon. Okay, we already connected. Now let's talk about the testing. Here I have the terminal from Mac, right? This will be our Mac remote. And in this window, I have the Linux machine. Let's see what's the IP address in the Linux part. IP address is 0.1.100. Let me see what's the IP address in the Mac machine part. fconfig, the very last one, ppp0, it has this IP address. 188.6 is for our VPN. Now let me run the Ux3 server in the Linux side. Run the iPerf client in the Mac machine part. So in the Mac, let me run iPerf3 and as a client, and the server IP address we got from the Linux terminal. In the end, I specify T parameter just to let it run for a long time. Okay, let me run it. Yeah, so as you can see, it's 150 something, and as expected, it's not super fast. But in most cases, if you connect from internet, that's good enough speed already. But if you check the SSH session, if you see what's happening in the server, you can see the total CPU time is almost 100% already, which means now the CPU is super busy and the router is already doing its best. The way we just run iPerf3 from the Mac remote computer is basically sending data from the remote machine to the Linux home. So from the Mac perspective, we are uploading data. Let's try the downloading. Let me use capital letter R. R means reverse direction, which means I want to download. I want to receive data. Okay, you can see the downloading is 200. It's better than uploading. Even though now it's better than 150, it's still not the full throughput of our physical line speed. As you can see in the diagram, it's green color. I'm using a 1 gigabit connection, right? So let me try. Here, let me run 5 parallel Mac machines and connect to them in 5 separate VPN connections and test the speed together. Let's see what's the result. Now on the screen, I show you 6 terminals. The first 5 are for the 5 remote Mac machines, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and this one is still the Linux home within my home lab environment. Because we need to establish 5 different IPerf3 testing sessions, I need to listen to 5 different parts. So that's why here you see 5 tabs for this terminal. I'm going to run the same IPerf3 server, but for each session, I specify a part. For example, the first one, I want to listen to 5201. Okay, and the second one, part 5202. And similarly, for the third, fourth, fifth one, I run similar command. Okay, I already run the 5 IPerf3 server, listening to 5 different parts. From the 5 remote Mac, I already connect them to the same VPN using the same username password, but they are 5 totally separate VPN connections. It's almost the same command as previously. The only difference is here I specify the part, right? Okay. And it's 150 something, right? No surprise. Switch to the second one. And for this session, let me connect to the part 5202. Okay. Interestingly, this one is super slow. It's only 50 something. And the first one slowed down to 80 or 90. Now they are close. They are both about 80. Then switch to the third session. Okay, for the third session, I use the part 5203. Enter. Okay, it's running. Now we have 3 parallel sessions, and you can see the first and second one, they are miserable already, and the third one is not good as well. They keep changing, so it's not very consistent. I will skip the 4th and the 5th window. I will directly show you the result. As you can see, currently all 5 are running. None of them is very good. And if I show you the SSH session, you can see the CPU is almost 100. I believe that's the reason, because even just one connection is already eating all the CPU resource. So now we are running 5. The total throughput is almost the same. As you can see, the system even dropping connections. The first one is already been kicked out. This is the result from USG-Pro. I won't show you the downloading one for the 5 parallel sessions because I believe the result should be very similar. Now let's move on to the UDM-Pro. Just like USG-Pro, for UDM-Pro, let's use just one Mac remote machine to start the testing. And I show the diagram here. This time the major difference is blue color link, which means it's 10 gigabits connection. Let's see whether it really helps the connection or not. Keep in mind, the hardware for UDM-Pro is much better than USG-Pro. Let's see whether it's a factor. I won't explain the details in the VPN setting anymore because it's exactly the same as USG-Pro. For the Linux machine side, let's get the IP address. Okay, it's 1.158 IPerf3 server. Okay, this is the SSH. Let me log on to the UDM-Pro and run top. In the Mac machine side, client setting for VPN is the same. I already connected to the VPN. I won't waste your time on the setting and connection part. Let me run ipconfig to check the IP address. Here you can see I got the 188 IP address, exactly as we expected. Okay, we are good. Let's start the speed testing. Okay, this is the command I'm going to run. The IP address we got from the Linux home machine. Let me run it. Better than USG-Pro. The first one even close to 200, right? But it's stable at 160, close to 170. Before killing it, let's check the top result in the router side. The total CPU consumption is not high at all. So 29 for the software IRQ daemon. The user session is 16 and the total is lower than 50. As you can see, the 49 is idle. Even though the system does have capacity to increase the throughput, it simply chooses not to. Let me kill the Ux3. Okay, this time let me run with the capital R, which means we want to test the download. Okay, it's close to upload. For both cases, it's 160 something. And the CPU consumption is in the same situation as uploading. And now let's try for 5 parallel connections. For USG-Pro, the 5 parallel ones didn't help at all because the UniFi router's hardware is so weak, right? It cannot support so many parallel ones, keep the same high speed. Now you see the exact same layout as in USG-Pro. I have 5 remote Mac machines. Before we start the testing, let's make sure our line speed is really 10 gigabits. Let's use this Mac 1 as example. Let's try the link between this one and this one, whether they are faster than 1 gigabits. Because this Linux home is behind the UDM-Pro. By default, the firewall doesn't allow the Mac 1 to directly connect to it, but we can connect from Linux home to Mac 1, right? Let me run a Ux3 server first in the Mac 1 machine, and here in the Linux home, let me run a client. I already got the IP address for the Mac 1. Yeah, just run it. As you can see, because of the hardware, it cannot saturate the 10 gigabits. But anyway, it's 5 gigabits, good enough. Now we are comfortable, so the line speed is really very fast. So let's see once we connect with VPN, what's the result. Okay, I already prepared all the commands for the 5 remote Macs. Let's run the client against 5 different ports. And here in the Linux home machine, I already have 5 tabs listening on the 5 ports. I already connected all the 5 Mac machines using VPN. Run all of them together. This one I forgot to use 9999. Let me run it. So let's see the total throughput. Even though they are changing, I can tell none of them exceed 200 and the total is much less than 1 gigabits. We can validate it in the Linux side. You can see the network history. The receiving speed is about 500 megabits. The situation is better than USG-Pro, but the hardware is still not fast enough to support so many parallel connections in very high speed. To validate whether the server is busy, let's launch the top in SSH. Now you see the SSH session into the UDM-Pro. Idle for the router is 7%. The device still has capacity to do better, but for some reason it doesn't. The total throughput I can get in the 5 parallel uploading connection. Now let's try downloading. Kill them one by one and add the parameter -r, run again. Okay, 5 parallel downloading. Total server throughput. Server sending is 400 megabits. Close to 500 megabits. Again, it's much lower than even 1 gigabit. Remember, our line speed is 10 gigabits. So that's the testing result in UDM-Pro. So the conclusion is much better than USG-Pro, but it still cannot even exceed 1 gigabits total throughput. Now let's switch to UXG-Pro. Again, the same layout for UXG-Pro. VPN setting is exactly the same, and I have 3 terminals open here. SSH into UXG-Pro. Run top. From the Mac remote, I already VPN to the UniFi router, Ux3 Pro. Because the Ux3 Pro has almost identical hardware as UDM-Pro, let's see what's the performance difference. Let's check the IP address first, 1.111. Then let me run the Ux3 server. From the Mac, let's connect to it, 1.111. Let's keep it running. First, test the upload speed. 160, almost the same as UDM-Pro. Kill it. Run the reverse testing, which is download. 160, almost identical result as UDM-Pro. Kill it. Let's run file parallel Mac VPN connections. Let's see whether it's the same as UDM-Pro. The exact same way as in UDM-Pro. Here I already run the file parallel Ux3 servers. For the file remote Mac machines, I already connected to the VPN and I prepared the command here already. Each one will run against different ports. Let me run them one by one. First, the download speed. I would say almost the same result as in UDM-Pro testing. Let's validate it. Let me launch the monitor in the Linux machine for network. See, it's 700. Yeah, a little bit better behavior than UDM-Pro. For UDM-Pro, it's lower than 500, even though it is still way below than the 10 gigabits line speed, but it's better. This is the corresponding top command output from UXG-Pro. As you can see, the idle time is 2%. Now the CPU is 100% busy. I believe that's why the performance is a little bit better than UDM-Pro. Remember, for UDM-Pro, we still see about 5-7% idle CPU time. Now let me kill all of them. Let's run the download. -R. Okay, all of them are running, and in the server, in the Linux remote machine, I can see the total sending is 600 megabits. Again, a little bit better than UDM-Pro. It's 14% idle. Interesting. That's why the download is slower than upload, because the system is not really 100% busy. We've already done all the 3 routers VPN speed testing. Of course, USG-Pro is the slowest one due to the weak hardware, and the UDM-Pro and the UXG-Pro are almost identical. UXG-Pro is a little bit better. Okay, thanks for watching.